with that, we are ready to tackle this very important topic, and let me turn it over to Amy McAndrew.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everybody. So I'll start by saying that the last couple of days have had a very similar feel to go back to April-ish of 2020, especially like when FFCRA first came out, and the lawyers are madly trying to read through hundreds of pages of documents, trying to understand what's going on, trying to give you guidance, and unfortunately saying, I don't know to a lot of questions. So I anticipate there's going to be some of that today. We're just not sure. But I think the overriding thing to remember here, two things. One is that there is a legal challenge. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But the other one is that the goal of the Biden administration here is to get as many people vaccinated as possible. So if you are thinking about how to interpret things, you probably err on the side of looking at it through that lens. And that probably was the intention behind whatever's in the rule. Okay, doesn't mean that that's what's ultimately going to be upheld in court, but that is the intention of what the Biden administration was trying to do. So let's start with that. Start with the legal challenge. I'm sure you've read about this in the news. There've already been multiple legal challenges to the ETS, and as you know, the ETS came out late last week. And then on Saturday, well, let me back up and explain a little bit about how this works. And I am not an expert in challenging OSHA guidelines, but apparently OSHA guidelines can go straight to circuit. When a challenge is to OSHA, it can go straight to circuit court. You skip over the district court. And what normally would happen is you've got challenges filed in multiple circuits. And guess, you can sort of guess which circuits the challenges are being filed in. There's no challenge filed in the Third Circuit. Employers in general are not attacking here. They're attacking in some of the other states, the other circuits where there's been more opposition to vaccination. And so what happens is the cases, instead of having the cases go simultaneously in multiple circuits, there's a lottery. It's supposed to take about 10 days for the lottery. And then based on the lottery, the case is supposed to be assigned to one circuit. And that one circuit will hear all the arguments and hear all the challenges, because what you don't want to have happen is two different circuits come back with two different opinions or two different decisions. However, apparently, any circuit can rule on a request to halt the rule before the lottery is held. And that's what happened in the Fifth Circuit. And the Fifth Circuit has courts from Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. So on Saturday, which is pretty unusual for a court to rule on a Saturday, but on Saturday, a panel of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and what that means is just part of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, ruled to halt the ETS, citing, and this is their quote, grave statutory and constitutional issues. So it's more a process issue. Was the rulemaking guidelines followed, administrative law rulemaking guidelines followed? Is there sufficient reasoning behind the rule? Is there sufficient reasoning behind the 100-employee cutoff and all of those things? It's not 100% clear if this, the halting or the ruling by the Fifth Circuit applies only to the Fifth Circuit or applies nationally. And like I said, we don't have any such challenge being filed up here in the Third Circuit. So what does all that mean? It means that this is almost certainly will go to the Supreme Court. It may go to a full panel of the Fifth Circuit first. That means all the judges in the Fifth Circuit might rule on this first. I know there is a timeline this week for the government to respond and for additional filings and arguments to take place. So it's very much a stay tuned as far as what's going to happen on the legal front. But what does that mean for you, right? That's not very helpful for me to say, wait and see. So I don't think you can completely ignore this. And if you remember back, I think a lot of people are thinking the last time we saw something like this happen was 2016, when the Obama administration was trying to raise the salary thresholds under the Fair Labor Standards Act for exempt employees. And if you remember, it was one judge in Texas, again, who halted those changes, and the changes died. Okay, they never went into effect. And a couple of things about that, though. One was that I was in private practice then, and I saw a lot of clients who had already made the change before that judge in Texas made that ruling. But the other thing is the reason that rule ultimately died was because it was late 2016 and President Obama was leaving office, and it was already clear that President Trump, or President-elect Trump at the time, was not going to fight for that threshold, that salary threshold. So very different situation here. Obviously, the Biden administration, has a couple of more years in office. They are very committed to fighting this. The question will be, how does that timeline comport with the timeline for what employers are supposed to be doing under the OSHA ETS? So what do you do now? I think my best advice is sort of prepare. Don't just stop, just start preparing to comply and see what you can do. Communicate with your employees. It's okay to say to your employees, we don't know. You can finesse it a little bit more than that, but it's okay to say to them, it's unclear. Also keep in mind that even if this rule does end up getting thrown out by the courts, you can still do it, or you can still do some version of it as an employer. Now, you may not want to. We may be late enough in the game that you've already made a decision that you don't want to mandate vaccines for various reasons, including recruitment and retention. But you can still make a decision as an employer that we're going to do, if it gets thrown out, we're going to do some of this, we're going to do all of this, we're going to do some version of this. So just keep that in mind. And these are the conversations that the top levels of your organization should be having with HR, and figure out philosophically kind of where you want to end up on all this. All right. So that being said, who's covered? One of the interesting things about this is it applies to a lot of employers with very limited past OSHA experience, right? Yeah, you're a financial services company, another professional services company. You're very much white collar. You've never really dealt with OSHA before, and you've never had to be concerned about this. OSHA, in your mind, was reserved for manufacturing type organizations, but now all of a sudden you're thrown into the OSHA realm. So keep that in mind. We think of OSHA, we think of workplaces that have significant safety concerns, right? And most people sitting at desks all day don't think of themselves as having significant safety concerns. So that's the first thing. This is applying to workplaces that have never really thought much about OSHA before. But this is sort of who, we've had a lot of questions about this. How do you get to the 100 employee count? It's for private employers with 100 or more employees, firm or corporate wide, for the 6 months that the ETS is in place. So let's say you don't have 100 employees right now, you have 98 employees. But in a couple of months, you're growing, and in a couple of months, you're definitely going to hit over 100. Yeah, this is going to apply to you then. So you should, if you're in that growth stage and you think you're close, you should really be planning for that now. Keep in mind with that, when you're counting to 100, you pretty much include everybody. Okay, you include your fully remote workers. You don't just include workers at one site. So you have multiple sites, you have 34 people at each site. Yeah, if you have 3 sites, 34 people at each site, you're 100. You include your part-time employees, you do not include your independent contractors. But just because the rule might ultimately not apply to someone, they still count in your 100 employee count. So you might have 110 employees and 100 of them are working fully remote. This still applies to you, may not ultimately have to worry about the mandatory vaccines or the testing for people who are working exclusively from home, and we'll get into that more in a few minutes, but they still are in your employee count. And then we've had this question a lot: what about separate but related entities? This is really all the ETS says, and this is the quote here: 2 or more related entities may be regarded as a single employer for OSHA Act purposes if they handle safety matters as one company, in which case the employees of all entities making up the integrated single employer must be counted. Okay, again, that might not be that helpful if you're a company that doesn't spend a whole lot of time on safety matters, right? You don't have a safety officer. You don't have someone exclusively in your organization who deals with safety issues. And so in that case, I think you also should be thinking about standards under other employment laws where we're counting. And so the one that other DOL type laws where we're counting. And the one that pops to mind immediately is FMLA. And if you sort of look at the test for affiliated entities under FMLA, it's a 4-part test. It's, do you have common management? Do you have an interrelation of operations? Do you have a centralized control of your HR labor relations? And what's the degree of common ownership or common financial control? So if you have two entities that really are tied together because they use the same handbook, they run the same payroll, et cetera, they're probably going to be a single entity for this purpose. All right, Kevin, we've got some questions.
Got a couple questions on this, good ones here. So thanks for all the questions. We'll try to do as many as we can. Someone said, does it count global employees making the count? And they specifically have less than 100 US, but a significant number in India.
So the ETS does not appear to address this issue. But again, if you look at it through the lens of the Biden administration wanting to include as many folks as possible, I tend to think, yes, you count those people. You're not ultimately going to have to worry about vaccinating them because they're remote. But I do tend to think, yes, they count towards your employee count. But that's a little bit of a guess.
Yeah, and that remote may not be, I mean, they might be working in an office in India, but they don't have, the US
remote to the US.
Yeah, they don't have any standing when they're over there. But again, if they were to travel here, then you'd have the vaccine, because they'd be, one of the things, and I think in the rule is saying that even if someone's a virtual employee, if they come into the office or go to a customer, that would be someone that would have to be subject to the vaccination.
We're going to talk about
that. You're not
that.
looking at their status, but for vaccination, but also what they're doing.
Yeah.
And then someone said, I'm reading mixed feedback on remote workers. Do those from home, I think you just said this, is they count for the 100, but if they're completely virtual, they're not subject to the vaccine requirement.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. Yep.
If someone's asked about separate EINs, again, I think you answered that with if they handle safety as one company, it doesn't really matter if there's separate EINs. Another question was, the ETS is in place only for 6 months. It's not a long-term mandate right now, but I believe they're saying it's the proposed rule as well.
Well, that would be the idea. The emergency temporary standard is 6 months. And then the idea is that they probably go through the formal rulemaking process to try to make it more permanent. We'll see.
Right. And we talked about so someone asked, will the Fifth Circuit Court apply, will it impact the federal contractor subcontractor requirement?
No, that's completely separate.
Are there any cases being brought on that? I'm not familiar with that.
Yes, I think at least 10 states at this point have sued over the federal contractor issue. So stay tuned on that one as well.
Okay. And then someone asked, does 100 count apply to those on leave of absence? Again, I think your comment about the whole 6-month period, if you don't think they're coming back during the 6 months, but if they are, I think you would assume you're going to count them.
Yeah.
Subcontractors, someone asked a question about subcontractors.
Well, same thing. The federal contractor and subcontractor issue is completely separate from the ETS. There are challenges being levied against those rules as well, but
well, I think someone said, what if they have subcontractors in their work, or what about like temp workers? I guess that's a question inside of facilities.
The ETS does address temporary workers if you're hired through a staffing agency. If they're if they're somebody else's employee, then they don't count for your head count. But if they're your employee, even temp, they're going to count for your head count.
Okay. Great. I think we can keep moving.
Okay. All right. So there also are states that, yes, and somebody pointed out the ETS has some really good examples of counting in various situations. There are some good examples in there. Agreed. So there are some states with OSHA approved state plans. In those states, state and local government employers and private employers with 100 or more employees will be covered by state occupational safety and health requirements. And keep in mind, I just sort of did our little mid-Atlantic area. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, New York, not included. Maryland is included in that. The state plans are required to adopt and enforce occupational safety and health standards that are at least as effective as OSHA's requirements, as the federal OSHA's requirements. So again, stay tuned on that. And that's, I assume that that's part of the fight for some of these states, but sort of stay tuned on that. But the assumption is just because you have an OSHA approved state plan, you're not out of this. So they're supposed to be adopting at least as restrictive plans as what the federal OSHA has done. So, all right, who's not covered? If you're covered by the Safer Federal Workforce Task, say that again, Safer Federal Workforce Task Force COVID-19 Workplace Safety for federal contractors and subcontractors, you're covered by that, not by this. Healthcare, you're covered by the healthcare rules, not by this. You have less than 100 employees in total, and then public employers. And I assume that that's not really who we have on this call. If an employer is covered by the ETS, does that mean all of its employees must follow the provisions of the ETS? No. Okay, so who doesn't have to follow it? If you have people who don't report to a workplace where other individuals are present, so you have somebody who goes into an office, or the only person in the office. I don't know how much that comes up, but you know, every once in a while I hear those situations. But this is the more interesting one. If you have employees who are working exclusively from home, they're not coming into an office. Is that something to consider here? I know that we all as employers are trying to get, or most of us are trying to get our folks back in the office. But if you have employees who work from home, who can work from home, who are able to do their job from home, does it make sense to keep them home at least a little while longer while all of this gets sorted out? Something to think about, because then you won't have to worry about whether or not they're vaccinated, whether or not you need to do testing. And then employees who work exclusively outdoors, and it really is exclusively outdoors. There's an example in the ETS of construction workers who go inside for meetings, and the OSHA was saying, no, those are not exclusively people who work outdoors. So, you know, if you have a workforce that can work outdoors, not ideal in places where it's getting cold, but that would include, you know, now all your meetings are outdoors too, if you want to have those people to be exempted from the ETS. All right, so what does the ETS require employers to do? Quite a bit. I'm going to try to go through some of these requirements. First one is determining the vaccination status of each employee. Now, the interesting thing about a lot of the requirements here are they're things we've been talking about on these town halls for months and months, and things that I've been telling you it's probably a good idea to get a handle on, right? So one of the first things you want to do, and you can do this, and I think you should do this regardless of what happens to the ETS, let's find out if our employees are vaccinated, okay? Under the ETS, there are a variety of acceptable proof of vaccination status. There's obviously the vaccination card. You don't have to get the original card. You can get a picture or a photocopy of the card, or a PDF of the card. Record of immunization from either a healthcare provider or a pharmacy, copy of medical records, copy of records from public, state, or tribal immunization system, and any other type of official documentation that's going to show the vaccination. The only way, at least under this ETS, that you can accept employee attestation is if the attestation includes a statement that the employee is unable to otherwise provide proof of vaccination. So I lost my vaccine card. You know, I got vaccinated at a clinic where the only proof I have is through the vaccine card, and I don't have it. And the employee is signing under oath. You want the employee to sign under oath, saying that they don't have a copy of their records, but yet they have been fully vaccinated. All right. This is another one. This kind of is echoes of FFCRA a little bit. Employers are required under the ETS to support vaccination by providing employees time for vaccination and recovery. And again, this is something we've been talking about for months and months on the town hall. I think that's a great idea. Anything you can do to make this easier for your employees is good. So the ETS says include up to 4 hours of paid time above and beyond regular sick or PTO to get each primary dose, and that includes travel time. Now, if the employee chooses to get vaccinated on a weekend or at a date they're not otherwise scheduled to work, then no, you don't have to pay them for that time. But if they want to get vaccinated during work time, you pay for those 4 hours. And then reasonable time, and this is interesting, we got this question so much during FFCRA, what's a reasonable amount of time to recover from side effects? And OSHA took a stand and said it's about 2 days. So reasonable time to recover. You can require employees to use their existing PTO, but if they don't have any more PTO, then ETS is saying you have to give them some additional time, which is always interesting at the end of the year. If you go by a calendar year, you might have to give folks some additional time. And again, some of this stuff you should already be doing, right? You require employees to promptly provide notice when they receive a positive COVID test or are diagnosed with COVID. Well, yeah, you want to know that anyway. So hopefully you're doing that already. And then immediately remove those first people from the workplace, regardless of vaccination status. If they test positive, if they're diagnosed, you want to take them out of the workplace. What's interesting is OSHA's return to work criteria in the ETS is slightly different than the CDC's. I think it's a little bit more lenient than the CDC's, and you know me, I want to follow the CDC. So think about what your return to work criteria does. You don't have to change it just because of this ETS if you're following CDC guidelines. And ensure that each employee is not fully vaccinated, is tested at least weekly, or within 7 days before returning to work if away from the workplace for a week or longer. So if the employee is regularly in the workplace, you're going to test weekly. This is for your unvaccinated folks. But if they only come into the workplace occasionally, you can wait to test them and just make sure they have a negative test within 7 days of coming to work. More questions?
We got more questions. We're going to keep them coming in. So someone asked a question about what about Texas? Does this preempt the Texas vaccine mandate? It does. Very clearly states that in the preamble to this. Can vaccination data, I think we've had this over the time period too. Can someone maintain that vaccination information in their HRS as long as it's not accessible? Did they talk about anything with confidentiality?
I don't know if what there is about that specific issue in the ETS. It's always made me a little concerned to keep it in your HRIS because this is a medical record that is supposed to be kept separate and apart, just like you would keep FMLA records or workers' comp records. And I know that in some cases, the easiest way to do this is through an HRIS, but I do think that might run afoul of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Okay, now we get some interesting sub-questions. So someone has per diem workers who may only work 10 hours per week. Do they still have to pay them for up to 4 hours? I think that kind of goes to your weekend conversation.
Yeah, if it's a time when they're not, if they choose to get vaccinated at a time when they're not otherwise scheduled to work, then you don't have to pay them for the time. But you also can't stop them if they want to schedule the vaccine at a time when they're scheduled to work.
You can't recommend that they do this on a day off.
I don't think it hurts to ask, but it seems to me that that OSHA is saying if they want to get vaccinated during work hours, they can get vaccinated during work hours.
All right, and someone said, can we offer an on-site vaccination clinic in lieu of offering up to 4 hours of paid time?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you have enough unvaccinated folks that it warrants a clinic, and you can set it up in that way, and you make it as easy as possible. Yeah, I mean, people are still going to get paid for that. Maybe they're gonna have to sit in the vaccine room for at least 15 minutes, right, to make sure they don't have a reaction. But yeah, for that, you're gonna have to pay them for that 20 to 30 minutes. But it beats 4 hours, right?
Okay. Someone wanted to confirm that the 4 hours was a requirement, not voluntary.
Yeah, the 4 hours is a requirement. The recovery time can come from existing PTO, again, unless the employee doesn't have PTO, then you have to give it to them.
Okay. Someone said, what about if they reveal a family member is positive? I guess they being somebody that's not vaccinated. Do we dismiss them until a negative test? I think that's already.
That's CDC guidelines. That's completely different from this.
Well, probably at the end of this, we'll ask the question, what if what's the implication of non-compliance? I'm sure you have penalties.
I got it. Yep. I've got a slide on that.
Yeah. And the question is, any requirements as to what type of COVID test? Can it be the at-home, the rapid, the PCR?
I've got a slide on that too, but
Okay,
yeah, basically, yeah, it could pretty much be anything. And we'll talk about that in a second.
Someone asked a question, is a negative test recommended after quarantine or before returning to work?
CDC has a couple of different guidances on this. One is for if you've had COVID, and one is for just if you have been exposed. And it can either be a count of days or it can be negative testing, but definitely check the CDC's website on that. It has not changed in a while.
Okay, let me read, there's one here. ETS seems to imply masking is only required for unvaccinated, different than the CDC recommendation based on transmission threat. Is it okay to include that if we're okay from OSHA, we don't have to mask vaccinated employees? Interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's the complying with OSHA piece, and then there's still the keeping your workplace safe piece, right? You overall as an employer have that duty. So if you're having everybody mask because you're following CDC guidance, I don't think I would necessarily stop that just because the CTS has come out. If you're making that choice, you can always do more. You just can't do less.
That's not a requirement. That's a choice.
Right. Yep.
They're not, CDC guidance on that is not a requirement.
Correct.
Regarding state employees in PA, do you think something similar is coming regarding vaccine requirements?
I haven't seen anything for Pennsylvania state employees. And when we had the Department of Health representative on, she didn't think anything was coming down the pike.
Okay. And then so I think you mentioned earlier, but if someone has PTO, you can say use your existing PTO. If you don't have any left, then you would give them additional PTO.
That's for the 2-day recovery
The
time.
2-day
For the
recovery
4
time.
hours to get vaccinated, you got to give above and beyond what you normally would give.
Okay. The question was, are you going to discuss when the masking goes in effect?
Yep, I'm going to talk about all that.
Should we track? So we also track booster shots. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, the definition of fully vaccinated hasn't changed and has not included booster shots yet. I guess that's another stay tuned.
Yeah, but it's nothing in the current regulations.
No, and one of my concerns about tracking booster shots is that now you might be getting into medical inquiries because, and even though I read a statistic that said probably 90% of people qualify for the boosters just based on some sort of medical condition, you don't really want to get into that inquiry. Have you had a booster? If not, why not? Or if so, why? Unless it's obvious based on age. So you might want to stay away from that.
So someone said, if employees are virtual and are not coming to an office for a meeting, but meeting off-site, would you still recommend vaccination or testing before the meeting? Also, same requirement for going to a customer location.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we can sort of play around with the definition of workplace, but I think if they're going to a place for work, it doesn't have to necessarily be your office. So I would not try to skirt the requirements just because they're not coming to your physical workplace.
So I think there's a couple of good questions here. Given that we could see a tremendous increase in the number of people needing to get tested, and I think the testing requirement begins in January, you said. So people are concerned about accessibility for testing, which I think also coincides with, I think you're going to see a lot more at-home testing capabilities coming into play. But I think someone's asking a question. Could that be an exception to the testing, the kind of availability issue?
And the ETS does address this. Of course, OSHA has no concerns over the availability of testing, but I have a concern, given all the supply chain issues we're seeing, and I think there could be a run on tests. So yeah, if you are at a point as an employer that you're not able to access testing, you want to document all of your efforts to try to get testing and how you've not been able to get it in case OSHA comes calling.
Okay. And someone asked a question, what about, does the ETS cover third-party visitors coming on site? I don't think so, because they're
Doesn't
not
address that.
No, yeah, now again, I think a lot of companies will have their own policies, which you can certainly do, saying requiring visitors to be vaccinated or wear a mask. Mm-hmm. But that's not going to be covered by the ETS. All right, let's keep going ahead. I know we got some questions, but we are running out of time. We'll try to stay a little bit if we can, but we're also sensitive to the 45-minute that most of you will allot for this. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a masking requirement that people were just talking about. So you're ensuring that employees who are not fully vaccinated wear a face covering when indoors or when occupying a vehicle with another person for work purposes, except in limited certain circumstances. And we all know those circumstances. You're alone in an office, you're eating or drinking, safety issues. So you have to wear a respirator or a mask. You're obviously not going to wear, or some sort of a safety mask. You're not wearing a cloth mask on top of that. But again, if you're following CDC guidance, and Kevin made this point, that's not a requirement, it's just a guidance. If you're following CDC guidance and you're having everyone wear a mask, then it's okay to go above and beyond the ETS's requirements. You have to provide employees with information. Remember this is in a language and a literacy level the employee understands, and that's a great point. Whenever you're communicating with your employees, if you have an employee population that their first language is other than English, you want to be communicating with them in their native language to make sure that they understand. And there's in the ETS, there's a bunch of information that needs to be disseminated to your employees. Again, this is something you would already be doing. If you're aware of a COVID-related fatality, you're reporting that to OSHA within 8 hours of learning of them, and work-related COVID-19 inpatient hospitalizations within 24 hours. And then, of course, this is the big one. It's developing, implementing, and enforcing the mandatory COVID vaccination policy, except where you're going to allow for testing and masking in the workplace instead. So everybody's asking about effective dates. So the effective date for the ETS is November 5th, assuming that what's going on in the Fifth Circuit doesn't change that. And although the ETS becomes effective immediately, you're not required to do anything right away. So the big date is January 4th of 2022. You need to ensure employees who are not fully vaccinated or tested for COVID-19 at least weekly. or if in the workplace at least once a week, or within 7 days before returning to work if they're not regularly in the workplace. And then the December 5th is the date for everything else. You're establishing your policies on vaccination, you're determining employee vaccination status, and all the other things that we just talked about. So these are your key dates. So really we want, and like I said, a lot of this December 5th stuff is stuff you probably already are doing, or you should be doing, or be thinking about doing. So you probably want to get working on this stuff. And then really it's the January, it's the mandatory vaccine or testing piece that it's a little bit of a wait and see with regard to what's going on with the legal challenges to the ETS. What happens if you don't comply? So the penalty is about $14,000 per violation, but it's, it'll easily go up from there because each violation, no violation is in a vacuum. So you could face a penalty of that amount for each facility, each area within a facility, or each employee within a facility. So it's pretty significant. And then there could be additional issues as well. There could be private lawsuits that come out of this as well. So it could be very expensive. And keep in mind that a lot of the enforcement here is going to come from whistleblowers. So if you have employees who are unhappy about the way you're doing this or not doing this, they might call OSHA and have OSHA come out and talk to you. This is a very, very big question. Who pays for the tests? Who pays for the time spent testing? So the ETS does not require the employers to pay for the cost of testing, but they do point out in the ETS that numerous states have, or they say an employer may be required to pay for COVID testing if required by other laws, regulations, or collective bargaining agreement. And apparently about 30 states have some sort of a law on the books right now, pre-COVID laws on the books that say employers have to pay for medical testing, or employers have to reimburse employees for business expenses if the testing or the business expense is being incurred at the requirement of the employer, which this would be. So in our area, Pennsylvania, New Jersey have those state laws. I was not able to find anything on the books in Delaware and New York or Maryland. But keep in mind, so based on what we know right now, it certainly appears that employers, at least in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, should have to pay for these tests. But I think what's going to probably end up happening is there's going to be employers who don't pay for the tests, and it's going to be a legal challenge. The employers are going to get sued over it. So that's a little bit of a stay tuned. You should also consider deduction from paycheck, minimum wage issues. So let's say you have an employee in a state that doesn't have a law about employers paying for medical testing. Still, if the employee pays for their own medical tests, will that take them below minimum wage? So keep that in mind, because that would be a wage and hour violation. And if you're testing as a reasonable accommodation, the employer should be paying for the test unless paying for the test would be an undue hardship. So your employees who have medical reasons or religious reasons for not getting vaccinated, the reasonable accommodation then is testing. It may be that you have to pay for them anyway. So all things to be thinking about as you're figuring out what to do around testing. And of course, time spent testing. Your exempt employees, you don't have to worry about them. They're getting paid a salary for however amount of work they do in a week. Your non-exempt employees, your hourly employees, everything we're seeing, at least preliminarily from DOL, suggests that you should be paying employees for the time spent testing. So keep that in mind as well. And it may very well be that as an employer, you want to take control of that time. You want to get, to buy the at-home tests and have the testing done at your work site. Let's talk about that again. I thought I had a slide on this. So you can, the testing that you can do is basically any FDA approved test. That includes the at-home tests that are out there now. The only issue is you can't, the test can't be both self-administered and self-read unless it's observed by a representative of the employer or a telehealth proctor. So what does that mean? That means you don't want to send your employees home with the at-home tests and trust them to test themselves, trust them to show you the results. What you want to do is probably observe the employees testing themselves and the results that they come up with. Or I have seen some concerns stated about privacy issues with that. But when I think of privacy issues, I think of a drug test. Yeah, you don't want to watch your employee giving a urine sample for a drug test, but I don't know if sticking a swab up their nose is the same thing. If it is, you devise some sort of a curtain. The employee goes behind the curtain. But I think one of the interesting questions then would be, and I don't know the answer to this, do those at-home tests come back as a result for insufficient sample? Because I could see employees not sticking it up their nose or not sticking it up very far in the hope that they have just, that there won't be enough of a sample for them to test positive. So all things to think about. I think some of the considerations some employers are having is, maybe we set up a desk or a table. And you probably don't want to do everybody the same day, right? Because then you're gonna have huge lines. But if you set up a table every morning, you divide your employees out maybe alphabetically and have a fifth of them coming each morning to get tested or something like that. And then you could watch the process. But it will be interesting to see what happens to the availability of testing.
And there are firms that will come in and do the, I mean, if you're really at the point where you have a large volume of employees that need testing, there are companies that will come in and do the testing. Again, it's a 1 day a week testing that you have to do, as well as you can get the, have the test available. So I think that's something you can assess once you kind of see where you stand on some of these questions. I'm trying to look through here.
I just saw somebody ask the question, are the test results medical information, and who can we share that with? The assumption at this point has been yes, that test results are medical information, just like vaccination status is medical information, should be kept in a separate file. OSHA has some requirements about keeping a log as well, so in case you get inspected, that they can see the log. But as with any other employee medical information, to me, that's very much a need to know. If you can limit it just to HR knowing, great. If there is a really, really good business reason for some other folks in the organization to know, think about that and what your potential risk is. But yeah, you might be in a situation where other folks need to know.
All right, so a couple of questions here. So remote employees testing to come in an office or go to a work meeting will not be able to use a home test. Again, I think there's going to be judgments about verification process that you'll have to think about with those. I don't think that's been addressed specifically in the rules. Are there any issues with employee privacy now, everyone knowing who's not vaccinated?
So we've kind of addressed this in the past when we've talked about vaccinated versus unvaccinated. So for example, if you're going to only test the unvaccinated, if you're going to only mask the unvaccinated, I don't see another way. Obviously it's a marker if you're masked folks or you're unvaccinated folks. The one of the things you can say is these are the people who have not given us proof of vaccination. But I just don't see how you would comply with the law without doing that, without making that distinction.
All right, someone said, do we have a choice of laying someone off that is unvaccinated, since the ones that are not vaccinated are also not going to voluntary test? I mean, if someone doesn't voluntary test, then yeah, for sure. I mean, it's you, because you now have an OSHA requirement with this law. So if someone's willing to be tested, I don't know about that. But
yeah, I think that's a little bit of
a
slippery slope.
Someone's
asked what the laws are that require this in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. I'm happy to send the sites out in the email that comes out after the webinar.
So someone's saying, is there a waiver we can have employees sign up to be able to share vaccinated status? Lots of contracts coming that we need to send vaccinated staff only and ask for proof of vaccine. Oh, interesting. So someone's saying a customer is asking for proofs of vaccination from people sent to them.
That's interesting. I mean, I would want my employees to agree to having that information shared. It's interesting that the customer doesn't accept your representation that everybody's vaccinated.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
Someone said, is there a sample communication to recommend when we roll this out?
We have not drafted anything like that yet. It's something we can think about, sure.
All right. And then someone asked, and I think it's a good idea, just to repeat what they have to do by the 5th and by the 4th. And a question related to that, which I'm not sure was a question I have, is when does someone have to be fully vaccinated? If they start telling people now, what is the deadline for being fully vaccinated?
So it would look like the 4th. So, and you guys are going to get these, if you get the follow-up email, you're going to get these slides. So the 4th is your vaccinator test deadline. The 5th, December 5th is everything else. So it seems to me that you want your employees to be fully vaccinated by January 4th at the latest. But remember that fully vaccinated means 2 weeks post the last shot. So it's 2 weeks post your single J&J, or it's 2 weeks post your Moderna or Pfizer. And the Moderna and Pfizer, that course takes a little while. So folks should be getting vaccinated now. And I really do think that's all part of what the Biden administration thought about when they did this, is that even though they knew there would be legal challenges, they were hoping that this would encourage more people to go out and get vaccinated.
And someone asked a question, which again, we've said this before, to reaffirm: can an employer require vaccinations and not give the testing option? And lots of employers have been imposing mandatory vaccinations, and this certainly is supporting that approach if you want to take that approach.
Yeah, the only concern is for religious or medical reasons. You've got to think about reasonable accommodation. It's still possible to say we can't reasonably accommodate, but you need to at least go through that reasonable accommodation process, that interactive process.
Okay, and then finally, someone asked, which again we just talked about, could the lawsuit stop the ETS? I think clearly that could happen, but as Amy said, I think part of this is to get people moving in a direction, even that there is a timing that really forces you to kind of start thinking about things right now.
Yep.
All right, we are out of time. Thank you, Amy. That was a great presentation. So as I mentioned, we will have a meeting next Tuesday. I know we have a lot of regulars that join us every week. As you kind of delve into this more this week, if you want to pre-send us any questions so that we can make sure we address those, because we'll have time for some of those next week, just reply back to the email we send later today or tomorrow with a follow-up. So if you give us those questions, we'll kind of sort through them and kind of handle this. But again, very important. Amy, great job on this. There's a lot to learn. I'm sure we'll be reading a lot more in the next week, what's happening, especially with the court cases. So we will keep updating everybody. And yes, you can also call the hotline, as always, for members. So thank you, everyone. Have a great week. Always something fun to do. Take care.